The Roth family lived on the very edge of civilization. Their Victorian home stood like a lonely sentinel at the border of Whisperwood, a sprawling ancient forest notorious for its eerie, unsettling silence. John Roth, a renowned historian, spent most of his days lost in his study, surrounded by dusty tomes and forgotten languages. His wife, Eleanor, a woman of delicate beauty and quiet strength, tended to their home and their daughter, NAILA. NAILA, a bright, cheerful child of 10, loved to explore the shadowy outskirts of the woods. She would spend hours weaving tales about the whispering trees and the unseen creatures that lurked within. Her parents dismissed them as mere childhood fantasies, but Whisperwood held secrets, ancient and dark, waiting for the right moment to unfurl. NAILA's once vibrant personality began to dim, replaced by a chilling detachment. Her laughter, once a constant melody in the house, had faded into an eerie silence. The sparkle in her eyes, which used to light up the room, was now replaced by a haunting emptiness. It was as if a shadow had fallen over her soul, casting a dark veil over her once bright spirit. Her playful demeanour vanished, replaced by an unsettling stillness. She no longer ran through the fields with her friends or played with her toys. Instead, she would sit for hours, unmoving, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. The joy that once radiated from her was now replaced by a cold, distant aura. She would sit for hours, staring into the depths of Whisperwood, a strange, vacant look in her eyes. The forest, once a place of adventure and wonder for her, now seemed to hold her captive. She would gaze into its depths as if searching for something, or perhaps someone lost in a world beyond the reach of her family. Her parents, alarmed by this drastic shift, tried to reach out, but NAILA remained distant, lost in a world they could not penetrate. Sleep offered no respite. They would call her name, try to engage her in conversation, but she would only respond with a blank stare. The warmth and affection they showered on her seemed to bounce off an invisible barrier that surrounded her. Nightmares plagued her, filled with whispering voices and shadowy figures. Every night she would toss and turn, her face contorted in fear. The once peaceful nights were now filled with her muffled cries and whimpers. The shadows in her dreams seemed to reach out to her, pulling her deeper into their dark embrace. She would wake up screaming, drenched in cold sweat, her small body trembling uncontrollably. The terror in her eyes was palpable, as if she had seen something too horrifying to describe. Her parents would rush to her side, holding her close, trying to calm her down, but the fear lingered, refusing to let go. Her once healthy appetite dwindled, replaced by a constant state of unease. Meals became a struggle, with NAILA pushing her food away, her face pale and drawn. The joy of family dinners was replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional clink of cutlery. Her parents watched helplessly as she grew thinner and weaker, the shadows under her eyes deepening with each passing day. The shadows under her eyes deepened, mirroring the darkness that seemed to be consuming her from within. Her once rosy cheeks were now hollow and gaunt, her eyes sunken and tired. The tears that streaked her face were a silent testament to the torment she was enduring. It was as if the light within her was being slowly extinguished, leaving behind only a shell of the child she once was.
Eleanor, her heart heavy with worry, tried to comfort her daughter. She would hold NAILA close, whispering words of reassurance, trying to break through the wall of fear that surrounded her. The bond between mother and daughter, once so strong, now seemed fragile and tenuous, strained by the darkness that had taken hold of NAILA. She would read to her from her favorite storybooks, sing her lullabies, hoping to bring some semblance of normalcy back into their lives. The familiar tales and melodies, once a source of comfort and joy, now seemed to fall on deaf ears. NAILA's eyes would remain distant, her mind seemingly trapped in a place where her mother's voice could not reach. But nothing seemed to soothe the growing unease that clung to NAILA like a shroud. The more Eleanor tried, the more helpless she felt. The weight of her daughter's suffering was a constant burden, a reminder of the darkness that had invaded their lives. She could see the fear in NAILA's eyes, a fear that she could not understand or alleviate.
John, pragmatic and rational, initially dismissed these changes as a passing phase. He believed that children often went through phases of fear and anxiety and that NAILA would eventually outgrow it. He tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, encouraging NAILA to engage in her usual activities, hoping that routine would bring her back to them. But as days turned into weeks and NAILA's condition worsened, his confidence began to waver. The passing days brought no improvement, only a deepening of the shadows that surrounded his daughter. The calendar on the wall became a grim reminder of the time slipping away, each day marked by NAILA's continued suffering. A chilling fear began to gnaw at his heart. The rational explanations he had clung to began to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He could no longer deny the reality of NAILA's condition, the darkness that had taken hold of her. The fear that had once seemed irrational now felt all too real, a shadow that loomed over their family, threatening to consume them all.
The ROTH residence, once filled with warmth and laughter, grew cold and oppressive. The walls that once echoed with joyous conversations now seemed to absorb every sound, creating an eerie silence that was almost deafening. The house, with its grand architecture and beautiful design, had become a shadow of its former self, a place where light struggled to penetrate the darkness that had taken hold. An unsettling quiet hung in the air, broken only by the creaking floorboards and the howling wind that seemed to whisper NAILA's name. The wind, which once brought a refreshing breeze, now carried with it a sense of foreboding, as if the very elements were conspiring against the inhabitants of the house. The trees outside, their branches swaying ominously, cast long, twisted shadows that danced across the walls, adding to the sense of unease. Objects began to move mysteriously. Books would fall off shelves, chairs would slide across the floor, and picture frames would tilt, as if nudged by an invisible hand. These occurrences, initially dismissed as coincidences, soon became too frequent and too deliberate to ignore. The family could no longer deny that something beyond their understanding was at play. Doors slammed shut without reason. The sound of a door slamming echoed through the house, startling everyone within. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to their presence with hostility. Each slam was a reminder that they were not welcome, that they were intruding on something ancient and malevolent. A palpable chill permeated the house, even in the heart of summer. The temperature would drop suddenly, causing their breath to become visible in the air. No amount of blankets or heaters could dispel the cold that seemed to seep into their very bones. It was a cold that was not just physical but emotional, a manifestation of the fear that gripped their hearts.
Eleanor found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, a sense of dread clinging to her like a physical presence. She could feel eyes on her, watching her every move, but whenever she turned around, there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched was so intense that it began to affect her sleep, leaving her exhausted and on edge. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the signature scent of whisperwood, permeated the air, even with all the windows tightly shut. It was as if the forest itself was encroaching on their home, bringing with it the decay and rot of the outside world. The smell was a constant reminder of the isolation and desolation that surrounded them. Flashes of movement in the periphery of her vision kept her on edge, but each time she turned to look, there was nothing there. It was as if the shadows themselves were playing tricks on her, moving just out of sight. The constant sense of being watched and the fleeting glimpses of movement made her question her own sanity.
John, a man of logic and reason, initially dismissed these occurrences as tricks of the mind, fueled by their growing anxiety. He tried to rationalize everything, attributing the strange events to natural causes or the stress of their situation. But deep down he knew that something was not right, that there were forces at work that defied explanation. He refused to acknowledge the possibility of something sinister at play. His skepticism was a shield protecting him from the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He clung to his rationality, believing that if he could just find a logical explanation, everything would return to normal. But as the incidents escalated, becoming increasingly frequent and inexplicable, even he couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. The logical explanations he had relied on began to crumble, leaving him with a growing sense of dread. He started to see the fear in Eleanor's eyes, and it mirrored his own. The house, once their sanctuary, had become a breeding ground for fear, and they were trapped within its suffocating embrace. The walls that had once provided comfort and security now seemed to close in on them, amplifying their terror. They realized that they were not just dealing with a haunted house, but with something far more sinister, something that fed on their fear and thrived in the darkness.
One night, as a violent thunderstorm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within the ROTH family, Eleanor made a chilling discovery. The storm's fury seemed to echo the chaos that had been brewing within their home for weeks, a tension that had become almost palpable. Unable to sleep, tormented by worry for her daughter, she crept down the hallway towards NAILA's room. The house was eerily quiet, save for the distant rumble of thunder and the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the darkened corridors. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the fear that had taken root deep within her. The floorboards creaked under her feet, each step echoing in the heavy silence. It was as if the house itself was alive, groaning and protesting her every move. She paused, holding her breath, straining to hear any sound that might indicate NAILA was awake. Peeking through the slightly ajar door, Eleanor froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. The room was bathed in an eerie glow, the moonlight casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to dance and flicker with a life of their own. Bathed in the eerie glow of the moon, NAILA sat on the floor, her back ramrod straight, whispering to the shadowy corner of the room. Her small frame was rigid, her posture unnaturally stiff, as if she were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. Her voice, though barely a murmur, sent shivers down Eleanor's spine. It was a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within, a place untouched by the innocence of childhood. Eleanor strained to make out the words, but they were just out of reach. A haunting melody that teased the edges of her consciousness. It was devoid of any warmth or childish innocence. NAILA's eyes, usually so full of life and curiosity, were now cold and distant, reflecting none of the light that surrounded her. It was as if she were looking through Eleanor, seeing something far beyond the physical realm. It was cold, distant, and chillingly adult. The words that slipped from her lips were not those of a child, but of something ancient and malevolent. Eleanor felt a deep, primal fear take hold, a terror that spoke to the very core of her being.
Terror, raw and consuming, gripped Eleanor's heart. She had faced many fears in her life, but nothing had prepared her for this. The sight of her daughter, so changed, so alien, was almost too much to bear. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear her daughter away from whatever unseen entity held her captive. Her maternal instincts screamed at her to protect NAILA, to shield her from the darkness that seemed to have taken hold. But her feet felt rooted to the spot, her voice trapped in her throat. She was paralyzed, caught between the urge to flee and the need to save her child. The fear was so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that it rendered her completely immobile. She watched, paralyzed with fear, as NAILA continued her hushed conversation, her words indistinguishable, yet laced with a chilling malice that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The shadows seemed to grow darker, more oppressive, as if they were feeding off the fear that permeated the room. Eleanor knew she had to do something, but what? How could she fight an enemy she couldn't see, couldn't touch? The answer eluded her, leaving her standing there, a helpless witness to the horror unfolding before her eyes.